Yeah, no, it took all of them. They're still working. Yes, 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 yes. Yes, I talked
Good afternoon. Before we begin the panel proper, I have a few anticipatory announcements to make that are all logistical. Once the panel finishes, there'll be some closing words from myself and from Celso Castro. But then, this is the big message, don't run away. This is for IDPPA members, not for audience guests, because we're going to do students and faculty both a group picture. So stay around for that. And also, Veronica will have a few things to say. This afternoon's panel is about a topic that is, I think it's fair to say, kind of rocketing to the top of the public policy agenda. And that is the role of technology, the connection to inequality, and to global futures. And we're very pleased to have three colleagues with us here today, all Brazilian, and that says something very good about Brazil, that they're paying more attention to this topic than perhaps some other places are. But I think that this is something that is increasingly moving to the center of the debate. It's a question that has many dimensions. It vividly illustrates some of the discussions we have had both in the student workshop and in sessions here in the conference about uncertainty, because as technologies evolve, they raise new paradigms almost overnight. And the technologies, as you know, that we're some of which are developing fast, from big data to artificial intelligence, to robotics, to various forms of cyber expression, are developing so quickly that, as one of my colleagues in AI said, he said, it's a joke in AI that when you go to a conference, that you're already discussing material that's 4 months old, which in AI is very old. So keeping that challenge in mind, I'd like to call on our first panelist, who is Gregory Michener, who's going to talk about supreme information institutions and rethinking the modern state.
Right here. Perfect. Good afternoon. Just adjustments here. Many thanks for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation. IDPPA and FGV, Celso Castro with CPDOC, many thanks again for the invitation. So I was very flattered to be called a Brazilian by our moderator. I'm actually Canadian, but I'm a refugee here in Brazil. I'm Canadian, married to a Mineira Brava, as we say in Portuguese, married to a woman from Minas Gerais, from Belo Horizonte, and ended up coming here after doing my doctorate in the US. So that's a little bit about my story very quickly. Now, I'm going to talk about something that actually is on the intersection of technology and government, but really is more about government. And the paradigms I'm going to talk about here are paradigms about government and how we treat, especially what we call accountability institutions. Now, primarily, but information broadly conceived has not been given the importance it deserves and commensurate with its importance. And I'm going to explain why in this presentation. So we all know that information is power. Data are to this century what oil was to the last one, a driver of growth and change. This has become almost cliche to talk about data as being important. We know data is very important indeed. But it seems in many ways that people are more concerned, and the talk is surrounding more about private data and personal data than it is about government data necessarily and transparency, which is really underutilized in many ways. And I'm going to explain or provide some reasons why that might be the case. Now, in terms of freedom of information laws, which are sort of the bedrock institution that provides sort of the transparency infrastructure for a country, at least in the 1.0 version of government. Here is 2004, right? So we see that hardly any countries in the world had freedom of disclosure laws, freedom of information laws. We call them right to information laws, access to information laws. We've got many different names for them. And then we see in 2017 how this has grown. So what happened? In 1990, there were 12 access to information laws in the world. In the year 2000, there were still less than 40. And in 2017, it has increased to 117 laws. So we've had this explosion of transparency laws in general, not just access to information laws, but also open data laws as well. And so these are open data government portals, open government data, as we say, portals, and the number of portals around the world. What you can see here is obviously a malapportionment of open government portals. Now, with the US and Western Europe accounting for the large lion's share of it, more than, they say that 10 countries have produced more than half of all data sets in the world. And so it's badly distributed, and I would say extremely badly used so far. We have not done a lot with government data, I would say, given its potential. So I'm gonna explain why, and first of all, just to talk a little bit about the importance of government transparency in general, just to do a little bit of a review. We know that better information helps us to make better decisions, to make more targeted policies, to reduce costs. No, we know that it helps in participatory decision-making, as we know from the experience of participatory budgeting. In Porto Alegre, Brazil, is destaque is distinguished there. And we know that transparency and open data can keep government more accountable, and that's typically the real emphasis has been placed on accountability. But one thing I'd like to emphasize here is also policy coordination. And so we just wrote this paper, which came out in the journal Environmental Policy and Governance a month ago in Early View. I wrote it with a colleague from the BNDES, a National Bank of Development in Brazil. And we analyzed transparency in the states that have Amazonian biome, Amazonian forest. And what we found are exceptionally low levels of transparency in terms of the management of forests by state-level governments. And without information, it becomes practically impossible to coordinate the national policy of forest deforestation prevention, okay? And so information is not only important for citizens and for accountability and so forth, it's important for government itself to be able to coordinate policies. Government often has this push and tug trying to get information from other parts of government. And in fact, when I was doing my interviews for my doctorate on freedom of information in Latin America, I found that many of the commissioners of these information institutions told me, look, 20% of all freedom of information requests are by government servants who are trying to get information from other parts of government. They find that these laws are more effective than asking for information. So they're actually using the laws. This says to me that there's a serious problem with information sharing in general, okay? And that this is sort of a remedial measure, okay? Moving on, dilemmas of transparency regimes. I think my big point in this presentation is to talk about the misallocation of resources. And I'll talk about what's called the Tribunais de Contas dos Estados in Brazil, which are the auditing courts. They're essentially a mechanism to keep the legislative, formally, the legislative branch's mechanism to keep the executive accountable, right? So they essentially audit and enforce the rules, ostensibly, and I'll talk about that a little, I'll come back to this a little bit later. But first, a little bit on the underutilization and lack of comparable metrics. The resistance as well is important, but the underutilization, so talking about open data sets, just 10 countries have produced more than just half the data sets in the world. It is very clear, as I said, that open data is not being utilized. And also in the case of Brazil, we at the Public Transparency Program look at and evaluate government efforts to provide transparency in Brazil. And what we find is essentially that people are not using these laws. In the case of Mato Grosso, for instance, a state in the south of Brazil, we had 300 requests recorded for the last year. In the state of Rio de Janeiro, which is 16 million people, we had fewer than 1,000 requests, okay? So the requesting rates in Brazil are extremely low at the state and municipal levels, Sao Paulo being an exception, and there are some exceptions. Sao Paulo, Paraná, Curitiba, etc. The federal government is doing very well, and in fact, I'm very proud as an adopted Brazilian to say that Brazil has higher compliance rates than my native Canada in terms of freedom of information compliance at the federal executive level, okay? So it is working well, transparency in some regions, but especially at the subnational level, compliance is not happening. One of the biggest problems is oversight. We just lack oversight in the cities and in the states. So we also face the ever-present resistance from the public sector. So public sector resistance to transparency is germane across the world. Everywhere around the world, we know that essentially there's an innate tendency to resist transparency. And so we looked at this in an article comparing the use and resistance to open data portals in education in the UK and Brazil. And it's funny that stakeholders resist quite vehemently, and ones that you wouldn't necessarily expect. Often parents, often the teachers themselves resist, and so forth and so on. And so we find a lot of resistance to information, to transparency and to open data, not just from the public sector, but also from the public in a sense. And so getting on with my main example here, and I'm talking about the misallocation of resources, I think that we should be providing more funding for transparency and for information. Why? Because people are not using it, because it's not promoted, and because it's really very unreliable. You go and you ask for information in Brazil at the state level, municipal level, we find that about so essentially 1 out of 2 requests, 50% of requests are not being answered at all. And about 1/3 of requests get a precise answer, precise meaning a relevant answer, no. And so we believe that we should be investing more in information in general. And one of the examples I'm giving here is the state auditing courts. Now, they have a illustrious history. They come from 14th century Portugal. Okay, so this is an institution that has survived throughout the colonial period and has been adopted into modern government. It is an institution that in of itself sort of presumes that only the state can audit the state. And most of the tribunais de contas that audit the executive branch governments at the municipal level in their states, they do not provide information on their auditing activities or what they've found, which they should be, obviously, because they should be the sort of information providers in a sense. No. There are exceptions. The state of Pernambuco has got one of the best transparency portals in terms of the Tribunais de Contas do Estado. So one of the most important things to note here is a misallocation of resources in terms of money. And so the average Tribunais de Contas in Brazil spends 0.9% of the state budget. Okay, that's almost 1% of the state budget is spent on the Tribunais de Contas, okay? Now remember that figure, 0.91, okay? We'll talk about Rio de Janeiro very briefly. Now Rio de Janeiro spends 0.8%, okay? So just below the national average, okay? So that's but then in 2014, which is a really relevant period here because we're talking about the World Cup and the Olympics during this period, where we found that all accountability systems ultimately failed Rio and that we had serious corruption in government during this period. We had failures not only from the Tribunais de Contas, but what we call the public prosecutor of the state, the Ministério Público do Estado, the controller, the auditor general, and various other entities at the state level. And so really what we're saying is that at the state levels in Brazil, the accountability mechanisms are failing, if not failed, in most of them, right? But 0.8% of the budget in 2014, and the budget was 75.9 billion reais, right? Which amounts to 607, so 0.8% of that is 607 million reais, which is US $187 million, okay? Now, by comparison, California, which has a population that's over twice, almost 3 times the size of Rio de Janeiro state, spends 120.9 million on the Office of the Legislative and Analyst Office and the Auditor General, both of which are branches of the legislative branch of government. And so we're talking about more money spent on the auditing courts in Rio de Janeiro than in a state twice as big and obviously far richer. Now, we're talking about gross misallocation of funds. And I think this is happening all over Brazil and in many countries. Brazil is not the only country. And I think that one of the reasons for this is the ossification of democratic configurations of government in a sense. Federalism replicates its institutions perversely and often ineffectively across states and jurisdictions, municipalities. So for instance, the Controller General of the Union, which has a very large presence in Brazil, has an office in every city and in every capital and in every state of Brazil. So it replicates itself over and over. And this, in terms of costs, implies extremely large costs for Brazil, right? And so Brazil has had financial difficulties. There's no wonder why. Federalism in general is an extremely inefficient form of government, in my opinion. It was great in the 19th and 18th centuries when communication was poor and it was difficult to get across the country by horse and buggy. But now we can travel to countries by jets and we have internet. The reasons for federalism were important when countries were starting and for autonomous control. But I think you can give a degree of autonomous control and at the same time maintain a certain homogeneity of standards from the central level. And I think that's what's really missing here. And I'll talk about that very briefly with, in the case of transparency, in the case of poor reliability, what we find is at the state level and the local level, the local government level, and this is not just in Brazil, this is also in Canada, this is in Argentina, this is in Mexico up until now, because Mexico has taken a very different turn in this sense. But you find that different governments have different ways of displaying information. And so the websites of Rio de Janeiro City are totally different from the websites of Sao Paulo City and from the state of Sao Paulo and the city of Sao Paulo. And so finding information on these websites is difficult for citizens looking across those websites. But not only that, when we try to evaluate them using robots, which Renato knows what I'm talking about here, using essentially robots that crawl the web to make sure that data is as it's supposed to be, or at least bringing it back so we can evaluate it, what we find is that we have to create a new robot for every website. Now, we should be standardizing websites across the nation so that information is provided in a very predictable manner, standardized, and so it can also be verified by AI and other artificial intelligence and other ways. But unfortunately, the heterogeneity is such because of federalism, because you provide the autonomy of local governments and state governments to essentially do what they want and design things as they want. So Mexico has actually gotten around this, and how do we get around this problem in general is the sort of leading question here. It's gotten around this by adopting what is really considered the world's first supreme information institution, okay? Now, why is this what is called the INAI, the Instituto Nacional de Acceso a la Información Pública in Mexico? Why is it the world's first supreme institution? India, for instance, has a constitutional law on right to information that is vast and very powerful and certainly national. but it cannot set standards necessarily the same way that the ENI can in all the jurisdictions of India. And so ENI has essentially quashed federalism. It has said, okay, you know what, we're going to pass a constitutional amendment to make the ENI essentially a fifth power, fourth power, and they will be able to regulate all municipalities and have the final say on anything concerning information at the municipal or the state level or the federal level, okay? And Mexico has a real legacy of quashing federalism and sort of, in a sense, bypassing constitutional autonomy for various different institutions, including its electoral mechanism, which has not always helped. But in this case, the ENI is an example of a supreme information institution that will, not only can your requester, if you want to obtain information from government, you will be able to go on to one portal and request information from the federal government and from the DF, from the Distrito Federal, and from Monterrey, and from Oaxaca City, or wherever else you want, okay, at one portal. And the government will, and the ENI will have the final decision on all appeals. Now, the difference here is the final decision on all appeals. What does that mean? It means that the Supreme Court cannot even challenge the decisions of the ENI, okay? So the ENI has an information monopoly on questions of information, essentially, right? And I think that this is a very fitting model for the 21st century. This is the century of information. We're no longer in the sort of, you know, bumbling around in 19th and 20th century. And I think that we see a lot of this sort of lag time in institutions, what has occurred, the lag in the United States and other countries in the world, because we have not moved fast enough to evolve our institutions to the needs of the modern world. And ultimately, information is obviously power. Information is the lifeblood of healthy markets and healthy governments. And we need to put more emphasis on information. And I think that we need to consider models such as the ENI as we move forward. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Gregory. I think we'll have a lot of questions related to that. One of my favorite moments in Gregory's presentation was the positive comparison in terms of honoring freedom of information requests between Brazil and Canada, because this is a nice answer to my colleague last week who said to me in response to some public policy dilemmas, well, we can't all be Canada. So now I can quote a Canadian and say, well, maybe you don't always want to be Canadian, as he didn't. Our next speaker is Renato Rojas-Souza, who's going to talk about algorithms, a very big word today, future and digital rights.
Well, good afternoon. I'd like to thank Celso and all the organization of the seminar for the invitation. I work in the Applied Mathematics School here at FGV, and we've been partnering with the Social Science School for long with projects that involves artificial intelligence, information, organization, and things like that. And what I'm going to present is a revamped version of a presentation I did this year in the Stockholm Internet Forum, where we were discussing the ways society could handle the discussions we should be doing about algorithms, future, and digital rights. I'm just showing you some questions and provocations and some news headlines, and I wish that your questions can guide the discussion a little bit. I'm planning to do a very short presentation. And first of all, I reject the idea that we are facing an impact, because technology always have been shaping societies, and we collectively have chosen all the technologies that we are using nowadays and the devices and gadgets. So we cannot complain, as we are not part of the mass that is choosing every day the types of things and the types of faults and consequences of the technologies we are using. And one could have a positive and see the silver linings of the data deluge. We have lots of information. We have lots of repositories of information nowadays. It could be a powerful mean for more democratization of the access to the information. More diversity can be taken as a way to attack bias and things like that. But sometimes more data means less information. We are drowning in the seas, in the data lakes and the seas of information. And too many sources and too many opinions and fake news and things like that can temper the value judgments that we do every day. And this is a consequence of the modernity. Unless you are willing to go to the forest and keep away of all the technologies and stop using cell phones and internet, and choose the ostracism. We have to, in a way, to accept a blind trust in the technologies that are offered us every day to simply keep on living. So our dependence is progressive and irreversible in some ways. And most of the citizens do not care about. Do you read the terms of the privacy terms and the small letters when you sign for a new service in the internet? Maybe some, but most of us accept the things and okay, I'm not interested in the terms of selling my soul. I just want to use the service. So privacy is not a question. We discussed the questions of privacy in the academic environments, but people in general is not worried about privacy in general. So this is a news headline from the New York Times that says that privacy is becoming a commodity. If you can pay for not having your data gathered and used every day, you are part of the small groups that can have private conversations and private data nowadays. And there's another thing. We are not willing to give up the commodities of the technology. And the technology is adapting to the way that humans interact. So this is a paper that talks about the way that the gadgets are adapting to our manners and tones of voice to seem more and more human to us. And Alexa, I don't know if you know, it's a software from Amazon that interacts with ourselves, and they are trying to be more and more human. They're trying to talk with whispers and try to sense if you're tired, if you're needy, and things like that. So perhaps we should talk about the ethics of algorithms. In theory, we could trust the algorithms are not affected by bias, cognitive biases, stress, pressure. They could be modeled by the highest moral standards. But they are trained on human data. So prejudice is inherent to the data we produce. I can give you an example on the self-driven cars. Could you trust an algorithm that may choose to kill you instead of the passers-by if it have to make a decision on less casualties on an accident or things like that? So now the lawyers, the philosophers are discussing the questions of the imputability, the auditability, and the behavior agreements that we may and we should choose to do when using these collective technologies that have the power to kill, like auto-driving cars, drones, the personal assistants, the recommendation systems, because we leave for the computers to choose what we hear, what we read, and the people that we are willing to connect, like in the apps like Tinder and things like that. They have to choose the people we will know in the future, our future spouses and and husbands can be decided by algorithms. And in the other side, health data screenings, they're deciding if we have cancer or not based on the data, based on the data that they collect. But they are mainly black boxes in which we trust more and more. And the question is, can we detect biases? Can these biases be automatically detected, discovered, and fixed? It's another news that says that algorithms are making us small-minded because they're taking more and more decisions on our behalf. And some people are very worried with this process, like this engineer on the Silicon Valley. Unfair algorithms can perpetuate inequality. They're being trained by humans. And people are starting to discuss what would be a process of democratization of machine learning. How can we open algorithms if no one understands what an algorithm is more than a long word or things like that? What are the traits and the decisions trees that an algorithm perform to take the decision on our behalf? So if we were to discuss which digital rights do we need, how can we start an agenda for discussing the digital rights we should be in the civil society? I try to propose some few, but I leave to you if they are the correct ones or the first things that we should discuss. We have the right to be conscious about the decisions that they are taking on our behalf. We have the right to know in which information bubbles we are being confined. Do you know we are being confined in information bubbles? We have the right to be forgotten. We have the right to erase our profiles and systems and be anonymous. And be anonymous nowadays is more than using a special version of a browser or a Tor, their own router, or technology that tries to hide your IP. Your internet provider, the NSA, they all knows about it. And sometimes it's best to be hidden in the masses than try to be anonymous. It's difficult to be anonymous. And algorithm heuristics have to be open. They have to be discussed, even for proprietary technologies. We don't want all the algorithms to be open source, but we have to discuss the heuristics they adopt to take decisions. And society needs to be mobilized. Education, activism, maybe the reformulation of the curriculum in schools. It couldn't be different, but I am posing the question. We need statistics, we need machine learning, we need computer science, even for the social science. Celso is organizing and swimming a digital humanities seminar the next year. So these kinds of questions are being discussed in the social science métier and not only in the technology side. For a new digital divide, we have to discuss what would be the new digital literacy, what we need to discuss to overcome this new digital divide. And well, you know the discussions about the elections, the hackers that tries to modify perceptions. And there's another question that we have to put in the table. The future of the employment based on the algorithms and the robots, like Greg was saying. Many professions will be extinct, and we are education nowadays for professions that still don't exist. Many others will suffer profound changes. And shall we, again, think about how to reformulate the curriculum? What is special for us humans against or versus the machines? We are good for unpredictable and non-trainable tasks. we are on the creative side, and we are not as so good as machines to reproduce behaviors, but we are good to learn new tasks. We are good to understand emotions. We are good in deciding what would be our highest spiritual values, what could be the desire for us in the common sense reasoning and human relationship. A machine that expects that in an accident, the last number of people should be killed instead of you is not a trustable machine. It may be right in the decision, but we wouldn't trust a machine like that. And these are very recent headlines. Better than human. Why robots will and must take our jobs. Or the meaning of life. This is from the same author of Sapiens. What would be the meaning of life in a world without work? If all the work is to be done by machines, what would be us doing in a few years? And what about the future? This is a small provocation. What would we expect for the future with prostheses and brain implants, and the way that this is not future, this is not fiction. These are things that are being tested and happening today. So and this I was reading this new today from the Financial Times. There's an engineer in the Silicon Valley that has founded a new religion. It's called dataism or something like that. But he proposed that we would worship artificial intelligence as our new God. It's not a joke. You can try to find in the Financial Times, and the guy itself is a very respected one. But it's the kind of things that are being discussed today. An ex-Google engineer has founded a religion as a spiritual response to the robot revolution. We should worship machines. Kind of funny, huh? And that's it. I will leave it to you.
Thank you very much, Renato. Very, very thought-provoking, raising a lot of issues. I hope there'll be a lot of comments on. I certainly have a number of them. As for the fellow with the new religion in the FT today, it is a joke, only he doesn't know it. So as many producers of knowledge sometimes don't realize in their cases. Our final presentation is by Carolina Taboada, and she's going to talk to us about the theme of technology and globalization and inequality and social inclusion. So she could have been on our inclusion panel as well, but she's here to talk about technology. Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank Celso, CPDOC, and the whole organization of the event for having me here today. It's been great to also hear Gregory and Renato talking. I've followed your work for a while, big fan, so it's very nice for me to be here with you today. And what I'm going to try to do is to give an overall view of the greatest dilemmas that exist today when it comes to dealing with informality and with the informal economy and how technology has entered this discussion. So hopefully in the end you'll have more questions than you have now, because that's the whole idea of it. So first, going a step back, we started discussing the informal economy and the informal sector around the 70s through anthropologists and sociologists who were doing field work, and they noticed that there was this huge area of vibrant economy happening where that didn't fit in any of the boxes of employment or economics or trade that were formally understood. So they started observing that, and in 72 it comes the first big definition of the ILO in a report they made on Kenya. And what's interesting about the ILO definition, the first big definition, is that there are two things here that remain present in discussions about the informal economy today. First is the popular view that informal sector activities are primarily of petty traders, street hawkers, shoeshine boys, and other groups of underemployed people. And the other one is already a recognition that the informal economy is also economically efficient and profit-making. So this has started moving very fast with globalization and with technological advances. And researchers try to keep up with it by broadening the understanding of the informal sector and of the informal economy, while also making it way harder to actually define it, which is natural because each time there were more different activities that could be defined as such. So I really like the second one because it brings the whole discussion, and maybe the biggest problem that I'm going to point out here today, that is exactly the distinction between people who are self-employed in small unregistered enterprises and people who have wage employments in unprotected jobs. So this is going to make the big difference between two big bulks of the informal economy today. People who manage to get included and to work through the informal economy and to create themselves jobs so that they could survive, and people who ended up being exploited because of that same possibility of informality in the end. So a few more things that I think are important to bring up to the discussion because they add up to the complexity of it is, first of all, the post-colonial critique. So when the post-colonial researchers enter the discussion, what they say is, look, what you're calling informal is actually things that had been going on way before the institutions that we have today and that we're calling formal actually existed. That's why people trust them more. That's why people resort to them more. It's because they were always here. They were never informal in the first place. They were just not on the format that fits the Westphalian nation state, let's say. Then comes the perspective of the orthodox economists when they start evaluating it. And what they're going to say is, look, what you're observing here is actually a big market distortion. The only reason why the informal economy exists is because hiring costs are too high. So companies do not hire as much people as the demand needs them to hire to produce as much as the demand exists. So if you fix these distortions, the informal economy is going to disappear. And that's actually the opposite happened. As international job market laws were flexibilized, the informal economy actually grew, and I'm going to talk a bit about why. Then we have a big tension caused by radical urbanization. And when I say urbanization, it's important to say that I mean people living in urban areas. That does not mean necessarily that they're living in urbanized areas. There's a difference. So since the 70s, informal living and informal housing have grown in a faster pace than urbanized areas have. And by urbanized, I mean with access to clean water, sewage systems, access to sewage systems, electricity, all that. So informal housing, even if it has some of these features, has grown since the 70s in a faster place. And that puts a big strain on public services, which is also something that needs to be considered. And then it comes a cycle of informality of sorts. And now I'm not just talking about the economy anymore. So you have a situation in which the person has an informal housing arrangement, right? So it doesn't have an official address with bills coming in their names with that address, which is something you need to open a bank account, for example. Only about over half the world's population has bank accounts today. So if you don't have a formal housing, you don't have a bank account. And if you don't have a bank account, you have a smaller chance to get a formal job in the market, for example, because most employers are going to want to pay you making a transfer to your bank account. So in the cycle of informality that ends up forming in large urban areas, what happens is that solutions start being created to cover for everything that the state's not managing to reach. And many solutions can be found there. And that's one of the big things to look about informality, especially as it started using technology at its favor. The fact that there is a lot of problem solving in informal arrangements. So one of the big questions is, are these informal arrangements chaos or a potential source of order? So who and what is informal in the 21st century? So one important thing here is that life is organized by flux rather than by stable income. That means that everything, every bill, everything that happens to that family needs to take into consideration that income varies very much from one day to another, from one week to another. Then you have a huge set of people that are inserted in the informal economy, and they're not all the same. So you have entrepreneurs who have chosen to remain informal because of taxes and costs and all kinds of things. You have the seasonal workers, and seasonal can mean that when they're not working on the farm, they have a job in the city, or seasonal can mean that they work for this very large corporation who only hires them for 6 months a year, and the rest of the year they have to figure out what to do. They can complement their income from formal work, for example. So the person has a job and it makes, I don't know, personalized notebooks in her free time to sell. This person is also part of an informal economy. And you have all the people in the formal-informal limbo. That is a bit of what this drawing suggests. So the formal-informal limbo is born when global value chains started spreading and leaving the basis of the production in countries where it's cheaper to hire employees. So no problem until then. The point is they started outsourcing that. So basically what happens today is that these big corporations got rid of most of the responsibility they could have from any work conditions these people are into. And these people are stuck in informal work arrangements, even though they are working for a formal established company. So the point is, who's the boss? No one knows in the end who's the boss and who can be held accountable for that. So that first picture is the one that I really want to focus on. So this is the street in Rio. So when you look at that, I think it's pretty clear that what we're looking at is a vibrating informal economy, selling stuff and very clear, right? The point is these products that we see, from the time they were produced to the time they got to the streets of Rio to be sold, they went from informal production to formal to informal again several times. So probably at the time they were first being made, they were in the informal economy because people who were informally working, didn't have formal jobs, were not inserted. And then someone bought them and exported them to Brazil, and that's a very formal kind of trade. And then they got to the streets of Rio, and you have street sellers selling them, and that's pretty much one of the classic definitions of what the informal economy is. So it's very hard today that you can define how this chain goes. The chain is no longer formal or informal. It can go back and forth in it. Here, I'll say where I'm trying to go. So the first one is the sign that a 13-year-old girl made offering her babysitting abilities. And the second one is a girl after school helping on her parents' shop, which is very common in Rio too. If you go to Centro da Cidade in the middle of the afternoon, it's very common to see kids in their school uniform helping parents a little bit. And I don't think that's a problem. The point is, these are also kids working informally, aren't they? The second one may not even be getting paid, she's just helping the family. But the point of these examples is obviously not to compare the situation, but to show the complexity of what the informal economy came to be. So the main example, and I don't know how I am with time, but I don't think I'm going to be able to discuss the Grameen Bank a lot, but so I'm going to focus on M-Pesa and mobile money and the remittance system, because I think that has been a major evolution. So M-Pesa, basically how it works, it was born very organically in Kenya from people working in cities, sending money to their families in rural areas. So how does that work? Basically, if you're in a big city, you bought prepaid airtime phone credits. Most people have done that at some time, at some point. And it comes with a number, a code. So you would text that code to your family, and that family, and your family with that code would sell those credits back. So these are all people without bank accounts sending money around. And this became institutionalized, now it's huge. But that was born from people who had informal jobs trying to find a way of moving money around, and they actually did. It works pretty well. The remittance system goes about the same way. And when I talk about remittance system, I'm talking about companies that take money of immigrants working in rich countries and make it reach their families in their countries of origin. So what's interesting about the remittance system, first of all, it's also made to go around the financial banking system because that's inaccessible to most. And second of all, that most recent accounts show that the amount that goes from rich countries to poor countries in remittances is about twice as much as official development assistance. So what this suggests is that the informal sector as a whole found a way that is more effective and more efficient of transferring money and helping the poorest people, something that international organizations and NGOs have been trying, and it's awesome that they try and work, but have been trying to work for decades. They found this, and it was way more efficient and today is about twice as much. So I'm gonna jump over the Grameen Bank because. So we have two types of information, two types of ways that the informal economy has been organizing on the past decades, and how to deal with them is maybe the big question here. So you have people who created opportunities out of it and who managed to create their own jobs, and now I'm not just talking about the economy, but also organize themselves in a way to supply for their needs, for their social needs, where the state could not reach them. And you have the people who got sucked into the big global value chains, and they're being used in the sense that they are desperate and they pretty much accept to work for almost nothing because almost nothing is better than nothing. So how to deal with the informal economy with these very two different sets of people is one of the big questions here. So other big questions that I think are the ones that guide a bit of the discussions on informality today. So can the construction and recurrence of these informal structures be seen as a form of insurgent citizenship? So what some researchers are going to argue that this is actually citizens showing that what the state is doing didn't work, it's not reaching them, so they created their own structures. And they're taking the citizen back in a sense. How to deal with the incentive given by consumers when you talk about the exploitation of workers. So everyone thinks it's an absurd situation how sweatshops are, but everyone also likes to buy cheap clothes and to be able to go to the store every week and find different things there. So how to deal with this incentive as well? Then, how to deal with informality, how to bridge the gap between formal and informal. And maybe the biggest of all big questions is how to do that if we consider, as I do, that there's a lot to learn and a lot of problem solving in the informal structures without losing what actually makes them work, which is fluidity, trust in many cases. How do you do that? How do you learn and how do you incorporate them in a sense without losing what actually makes them work in the first place, that is that they are different from the state? So I think this is the last big questions I want to leave you with. I hope I've brought some provocations to you today. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolina, and thank you to all our panelists. Richard Thaler just won the Nobel Prize for Nudge Economics, so I'm going to exhibit a little bit of nudge panel chairing and try and shape the discussion a little bit. I'd like to offer some comments that I hope will lead to even more questions that I suspect you have about each of the talks. Starting with Carolina, we've been here actively pursuing new paradigms, and this is hilarious. The map in back of us is inverted. And we've had a paper this morning on the informal sector in India by Dipanshu that was very interesting. But I'd like us all to think a little bit harder about what the informal sector may look like 20 years from now. And if you want to look at 3 cities, you could pick the 3 cities I've lived in the last 20 years, and they are New York, Beijing, and Moscow. So they span east, west, north, south. And what you see there is a new economy that's informal, that's often referred to as the gig economy. It's people making a living through a series of projects, or gigs in American English. And all those people young people sitting in Starbucks and other places are not only sending pictures of the food they eat and of their kitty cats, but they're also working. And this is an informal sector that's going to grow, that's growing exponentially. It's going to continue to grow. It is not confined to the first world only. It's very, very big in Beijing. You see a lot of young people who are working through a series of gigs. It raises all kinds of questions about, as you pointed out, lack of pension, lack of social protection in general, and above all, flux and instability. But that's going to be another, because what Renato was talking about, which is absolutely right also, is that we're going to be looking at totally new patterns of employment and of even the time that human beings spend. For my sins, which are many, I was asked to give a talk at the Harvard Kennedy School last month on, God help me, artificial intelligence and the future of public policy. And one of the things I was looking at was how employment is going to change. And that's obviously a very big theme. As Renato pointed out, we're educating the established education systems in many countries, particularly in the United States, are doing an excellent job of producing people qualified for jobs that are disappearing. And there are a whole new range of jobs that are being created as we speak that people are not being trained adequately for in mainline education. So this is clearly one very big challenge. Even, as I was saying, the texture of human life is going to change. What indeed, as we see, there are going to be a number of jobs, particularly repetitive manual jobs, that will disappear because robots can do them much more effectively and much more cost efficiently, so that you may have people, including the people I mentioned in the gig economy, who have more time on their hands. What do you do with that? There are a number of very creative solutions. One, of course, which is already being tried out, I think, in Finland, is universal basic income. But another one is the idea of voluntarism, of giving people social credits, pension credits, social security credits for volunteer work, and mobilizing an entirely new and hitherto non-existent workforce for social good, using people's volunteer time. That's another exciting thing that people are talking about. Renato mentioned algorithms, and I really agree. I think he made some very important points about, first of all, technologies have always been a challenge. Technologies have also always caused social disruption. But algorithms and the nature of the change that we're undergoing now is simply faster. I think that's the real challenge, is that the pace is, algorithms are accelerators, they are magnifiers, they're multipliers, and they make everything happen at hyper speed. So we live in society, we had a pretty good lead time on the Industrial Revolution. I mean, but now this is very different. This is very fast, and a lot of the social institutions and indeed ways of thinking are not necessarily able to keep up to that. And I'll just say a bit about Gregory's talk, which I found fascinating. And I think his opening point is a very powerful one. And it actually articulates very nicely with what Renato said about the idea of privacy being a luxury, is that a lot of the focus so far on data and so forth has been focused on, what a surprise in this era, what does it mean for me? Rather than what does it mean for institutions, for governance, for various collaborative mechanisms. So rather than talking about privacy issues and so forth, all of which are very important, because Renato's right that you should have a right to be anonymous, to step out of things if you want to. But I think there are much broader implications, and let's be frank, some positive ones about how government can function better using data. As Gregory has pointed out, it's not happening yet. There's very poor articulation, poor policy coordination, but there are great potentials. When I spoke at Harvard, a colleague of mine from the Kennedy School presented after me a case study of how artificial intelligence can improve governance. And this is a project done, it's actually funded by a foundation, the Bloomberg Foundation, and done by students in the Kennedy School, policy students like those of you in the audience. And what they did was to take the small decaying, a lot of them decaying industrial towns surrounding the Boston area, purely using data, and look at the public records, the public information on what are called derelict properties that have been abandoned and closed up and are boarded up. And then to connect that with a whole continuum of data going back into the tax system. And what they found was that you could create very good predictors for which properties were going to become derelict. Now, derelict properties are a huge burden to local governments. They become magnets for crime, for all kinds of bad things, and they come off the tax rolls. So the city's tax base sinks. So these students working with AI were able to set up a set of predictors for properties that would become derelict. And what they found was that there was a very strong correlation between tax delinquency and abandonment. In other words, you could predict that a property might be heading, using certain algorithms, toward dereliction by looking at people getting further and further behind in their taxes. It's very logical, but it's still a very good example, and just a small one, of how government can function better using data. But as Gregory's saying, we're not there yet. So I'll stop and I'll take questions, ask you to identify yourself. We have microphones waiting, and who wants to go first? Victor. Tell us who you are, Victor. You're a mysterious person, even to those of us who know you.
Thank you, and especially thank you for mysterious person. But first of all, thanks a lot for great presentations. I actually have questions to all of panelists. And my first question to Gregory.
Tell us who you are.
I'm Victor Vakhtin, Moscow, RENEPA. So you see a lot of Russians here, like Robin Lewis, right? Who is also from Russia, as I can see from here. So Gregory, it was a really great presentation, but I still have a question. It looks like this advocacy for openness of information and freedom of information that you propose actually sounds a bit like a way of crushing federalism more than support democracy. It's not like about let people know what the hell is going on with the government, but let the government know what the hell is going on the level of states. So it's more like technological Bismarck or technological Vargas, sorry if it's not politically correct, and FGV. Or I don't know, there is a joke about Russian technological optimists who love technology just because they hate people. So it's like vegetarians who do not eat meat, not because they love animals, but because they hate vegetables. So it looks a bit that in your technological framework, federalism is more evil enemy than anything else. What's wrong with this? It's a first question. Because I could take a Marxist stance and say, probably you're advocating a new alliance of big corporations like Google and Amazon together with centralized government in order to fight freedom of states, right? So it could be seen from this perspective. I would love you to comment on this a bit. May I continue or yep. Renata, thanks a lot for for this brilliant technologically optimistic thing. We are from STS, Science and Technology Studies. We're Latourian people. We never believe in a cleavage between technology and society. That's why when we say that technology always shapes society, the second question is where the hell technology came from. It's not something out there from society, right? It is already in there. But here is always a huge discussion in STS, started by Don Mackenzie from University of Edinburgh, about algorithm. The problem not an algorithm itself, but when it becomes unified interface for decision making. And the great work of Mackenzie called An Engine, Not a Camera, about Black-Scholes Merton formula used for option markets, markets of derivatives. That before every trader used the same algorithm in order to produce some kind of decision, it worked fine. But as soon as it became some kind of common denominator for all decision makers, market collapsed completely. And what about this kind of unification effects, or as we call it, Mackenzie effects here? And question to Carolina, it was great, and but here is a question: when informal is becoming more and more technologically advanced, isn't it becoming a bit more formal? Because you leave more digital traces, you are becoming much more controlled or possibly controlled. So from one side, yes, it liberates you, it emancipates you, it gives you lots of possibilities. But on the other hand, with the big data algorithms that Renata is probably working on, you are becoming much more transparent for controlling organizations than before, when it was really informal and untechnological way of communicating and transactions. Thank you very much.
Paul, then Nicola, then Deepak. Fearful. One at a time. Everybody else here.
Hi, Paul Curry from Stellenbosch, South Africa. Thank you very much for the presentations. Very good. I want to echo Victor's query about the monopolistic supreme information institution. And when using the word monopoly, all sorts of connotations about lack of diverse options or access or things like that, or competition, or anyway, maybe if you can clarify how the public can access information and how that's supporting democracy or supporting access to information as opposed to hoarding it. And then to perhaps challenge Victor, but also comment on Carolina's notion of informality. I think you're falling into a trap that many of us experience, which is trying to critique or examine or look at informality while using the language of formal and informal, which I'm getting more and more, I'm having more and more trouble detaching myself from. And I think there's so many facets of informality, and we're using this sense of a vibe that you can look at something and think, oh, well, it's informal. But we actually need to start understanding what aspects of that there are. Is it regulation? Is it that there's a paper trail? Is it that it's vulnerable? And so as an anecdote, I'd say the most successful, or one of the most successful informal enterprises in South Africa and many parts of the world are the minibus taxis. And they're incredibly good businesses. They're making minibus taxis, matatus, trotros, all sorts. And they make great profits. They offer a good service. They're reliable. They're adaptable. They have different routes. They're not necessarily regulated by the state, but they are heavily self-regulated. They have different territories that they cover. Passengers will also regulate the drivers. So I suppose a question is how do we account for other forms of regulation? Yeah, and again, not to move towards formalization, but to move towards better safety of these systems or something like that. Thanks.
Nicola. Yeah.
So, Nicola Ranepa, I have one question for Renato and also one comment. The comment would be, because you talked about digital rights and right to be forgotten and right to knowledge and other types of rights. I think even more important in this like legal aspect of data and just the digital space is obligations rather than the rights. For example, what would be the obligations of a developer of AI technology in case if the AI misbehaves? For example, if let's say Tesla's car crashes by chance into a pedestrian just for no reason, who takes the blame? Then in terms of designing of AI, how should it be done? What restrictions should be put on companies and individuals? So that's the common part. I think there is a lot to talk about obligation related with data. And then I have a question also because you mentioned the right to consciousness, if I'm not mistaken, in terms of digital rights. I think it was the first one on your slide. Could you please elaborate how you connect the right to consciousness with data and just the digital world itself? I'm curious because usually that's something connected with freedom of thought, with freedom of expression. So I'm really interested to hear your opinion on this. Thank you.
Let's take one more question from Dipanshu, and then we'll have answers in a second round, if that's okay.
Thank you. No, I just wanted to build on Dr. Lewis' interjection. I guess so I've been involved as one of the members trying to work with ILO to assess the impact of automation on various sectors within the Indian economy, trying to look at the formal and informal segments. So we've been working closely in looking at both manufacturing and services, and which has been representing quite mixed results. First of all, we don't have a metric for assessing how technology per se impacts labor market constitution. That's been a huge debate in the growth diagnostics, that do you use total factor productivity? What proxy do you use to assess that? But regarding not going into the technicalities, I guess one very good way to understand is to look at the task content of jobs, whether the jobs by their very nature are more cognitive, requires the mind. So you may have a bank teller working with more of that person is likely to be replaced by a robot, as against a physical manual labor task, which is, let's say, working in a textile industry. So we've been trying to kind of disaggregate these trends. The unfortunate trend seems to be right now that the government, for example, in India, is focused a lot on skill-based technology. There's a Ministry of Skill Development and Entrepreneurship. So whatever skills they're trying to train people to get onto, unfortunately, are likely to be or most threatened by the automation process. So in fact, in the next 10 years, whatever skill development will happen of these people, they will no longer have jobs within the areas, right? So that's a huge issue which we're trying to grapple. So I guess that's important to put across on the table. Do you look at skill or do you look at task content of jobs? Because in services, there's a positive impact of how technology is creating more spillover jobs. So you have a Flipkart or an Amazon coming, and it's creating a huge demand for delivery boys. So there's a huge rise for demand of other kinds of jobs within the segment, while in manufacturing, the trend is the opposite. Gregory, I just wanted to kind of push a little bit further on what you were proposing with the INAIA supra or ultra-institutional information formation. Is it probably okay to talk about an argument where you're looking about a global leadership institutional formats, like an International Institute for Information, like a III, which may have, like the World Bank, have Shepard committees with a global membership, sanctions. I think the idea of having a international or global representation of an institution which is protecting for information, fighting for those monopolistic tendencies may seem a bit more viable as against kind of national monopoly centers, because that, I mean, Google and a lot of other organizations are still trying to do in their own respect. And lastly, just with Renato's, I found your presentation fascinating. I think philosophy and AI have a lot to go along with. So I guess there's a lot that one can work towards. The only question that often comes, which is a big question in philosophy, is when you talk about ethics, ethics often come with certain moral intuitions and moral frameworks. How does morality work in itself is a big question. Do you talk about social values, norms? So can we first probably think or push ourselves or nudge ourselves to talk more about norms which accommodate for a certain ethical framework, in moving towards an algorithmic process. I think that in itself is something that would be helpful. Thank you.
Who would like to go first? Sure.
Okay. Interesting comment and very, poignantly put. There's a couple issues here, and I think that what I'll start with is what I'm really talking about more than anything else is enforcement of governments being transparent for their own sakes, to share information among them and coordinate policies well, but also for citizens to use that information, media, etc. I mean, there's multiple stakeholders. In fact, the biggest user in the US is businesses, right? So businesses in Canada as well use, 40% of the requests are from businesses. So there's a lot of uses for businesses as well. And so the idea here is essentially the observation that in Brazil, as in Mexico and other countries in Latin America, local, that is state and municipal government enforcement of freedom of information, transparency, open data, etc., anything informational, is weak, okay? Now, that means that essentially lower level governments are less compliant with the law, they implement it poorly, etc., etc. This is the inverse in Canada and the United States and other countries that are very developed, because Toronto is more transparent than the Canadian federal government. And so is Austin, Texas, more transparent than the state of Texas or the US government. And so, I mean, there is this inverse relationship that I've found, which I have not actually written about yet, but it's something to write about if I can get some empirical data to marshal it in that direction. But I think that one of the big questions is about enforcement. And so, I don't think that the supreme information institutions are necessarily useful in all situations. The point is to make the information, to make sure it's there, make sure that they're providing it well. So it's more of an enforcement question than a sort of, gather all information, the Orwellian sense of, great complicity among governments and even corporations in terms of controlling people's lives. No, this is government information after all, not personal information. But it's a good comment and something to consider. And obviously, as you said, this is an unrealistic proposal. It is right now, but I mean, so was, Social Security back in the 1700s. So, I mean, these are things that move forward over time, right? I do think that information is important. I didn't get the other part of your question. Is there another part of that, or? Monopoly over, yeah, so what I'm saying is not for government to monopolize. I'm saying for a central supreme information to have this sort of enforcement power that can really coerce governments to provide the information. And the problem is that here in Brazil, for instance, I'll give you the example of Rio. It's my favorite. I love to hit Rio, right? Rio State, very quickly, Rio State, when the federal law was passed, it's a constitutional law, 12.527. The law had to be regulated by all the subnational entities, meaning states and municipal governments. So everyone had to actually write their own regulation for the law. When Rio State wrote the regulation for the law, they made an illegal regulation that has never been challenged, unfortunately, but basically said that every requester had to go in person to request information, whereas Article 10 of the federal law says by any legitimate means, which means internet, phone, any other legitimate means. And they said that you have to, and in Rio, you had to sign a responsibility waiver saying that you would not use the information illegally, which is tantamount to signing a waiver when you take your newspaper in the morning and saying you won't use the information illegally, totally illogical. But an intimidation tactic, clearly, no. And so in this sense, we need enforcement, centrally or otherwise, but it's not happening here in Brazil. And information is very poor, and as a result, media coverage is often very poor of public policies, not corruption, but public policies in general. And public policies are suffering.
Well, thanks for the questions. I'll try to address your points, but I have to say I'm as you. I'm observing the phenomenon and I'm trying to make sense of all the things. But let me see if I can address all of your points regarding the process of impact, or if is there or not an impact. I am supported by some ideas from Giddens and the consequences of modernity. He says that one of the main characteristics of the high modernity, of not the post-modernity in which he doesn't believe, is that we have a blind faith in information systems. We don't think before entering an elevator or going with our cars in a bridge if the concrete technology is okay, or if the elevator's motor is functioning well. And I guess all of our societies nowadays are based on this kind of faith that we have, because we cannot live anymore taking decisions every day if we are not trusting the devices and the water purifiers and all the things that we used every day without thinking, if we didn't have this faith in technology. And what happens with artificial intelligence and machine learning is an exacerbation of the same process. I don't think that we could, if we had to discuss all the things that are being developed and deployed every day in all the places, academy, government, smart cities, the Internet of Things, it wouldn't be feasible to bring the discussion on the consequences of using for the great masses every day. So we have to accept this blind faith as a way of living nowadays. It's just an idea that I support from Giddens. The blind faith is a consequence of the modernity. You touched an interesting point on mentioning the Black-Scholes algorithm for trading markets. I believe in the information asymmetry as a source of revenue and something that is desirable for the actors in all kinds of arrangements. If you are the first to use a high frequency trading algorithm to let's say to mine, to exchange options, or to mine your bitcoins with a great GPU, you will be the first. You will have the opportunities, but as soon as the information spreads, you lose these advantages of being the pioneer. And so this is a natural phenomenon. I don't know if it was your point, but it's a natural process. The asymmetry, you have the newcomers, you have the pioneers, and they usually are the ones who get the most out of the technology, and then we are the followers that simply adopt the technology after many people have already got a lot from these technologies. And there are some questions about the design of auto-driven cars and AI and ethics. It's been a highly debatable matter in academy, in the industry, because we are not anymore in the times in which the 3 laws of robotics by Asimov were enough to decide. The robots cannot hurt anyone. But in many situations, that they will have to decide, or they will have to follow decision 3 to decide what to do. And what is acceptable? Would you buy a car that will decide to kill you in some situation? But and you can have different cultural traits that would change the algorithms from place to place. Is the old people more important to keep, or the new people because they have years of life ahead? So this is not I beg apologies if I meant to pose any solution to the problem. I just said that it's being discussed in the academy, and the problem is not technological. It's more in the philosophy side and the law and the society and the cultural side. We have to solve our preferences and our ways of doing things before we can expect the device and gadgets to do this for us. But this is not happening. And this brings us to another question. How can we instill, how can we expect ethics to be discussed? As a person from the academy, I tend to believe in the education. I tend to believe in raising the awareness of these questions, because most of my students are far from worried about the privacy, or they are not formulating this question that we perhaps should be doing about algorithms, about decisions. It may be a generational aspect, that the millennials that were born with all these things already deciding and happening. But maybe we should put in the curriculum, and we should discuss data science and algorithms and machine learning along with ethics and philosophy, and these questions that arise when we are dealing with humanity and these questions. I don't have answers, and I don't even know which are the kinds of questions we should put in the curriculum. But I'm trying to at least to raise the discussion in the information technology classroom. Well, how do we? Well, it's the same. How do we implement the right to be conscious if we lack the desire to? Sometimes the ignorance is a bless. Everybody knows that. We don't want to be conscious, because we will have to choose to use things and not to use some other things. But you're not anymore. Nobody who has had contact with this kind of questions will have the bless of ignorance anymore. So I'm trying to raise these questions in the appropriate forum to see if we can start to discuss how can we change society, and how can we ask the right questions for us to overcome this kind of apathy and we are experienced today. People are not doing anything apart from very specific environments about this ethical questions and philosophical questions. Not in my classes, at least. And well, the question of jobs. I agree that there are some silver linings and the brighter sides in the questions. But as a person who lives in a third world country, I don't think we have reached the point in which we can have the most out of these technologies, because most of our occupations, like Carolina was saying, are not sophisticated and can be easily substituted by machine-oriented and deployed things. So if we live in Sweden and other country where you have the politics of minimum wage and things like that, we could put these people to more creative tasks and think about the society, and maybe to try to think what are the good questions that would develop new solutions and new ways to act. But I don't know how can we do this in the society, in the state we see today. We're not in the point that people have good things to do with their extra time if they're not being employed in the usual aspect. But I think that Carolina can talk better than I about that.
I think your two questions, they have a point of contact between them, which is in the end comes to what do we call formal. So you asked me if embracing technology and informality doesn't make it more formal in the sense that it starts leaving a bigger footprint. Depends again on what we're calling formal. I mean, if formal is understood as having regulation, a regulation that has internationally recognized actors such as a state, for example, by and through the state. Obrigada. By and through the state, you may say. If that's what we call formal, and usually that's what people call formal, right? What is regulated by or through the state. If that's it, simple as that, then I don't think it's making it more formal in the end. If we're going to look at formal as more than that, as organization and paper trail and registration, and for example, if the government decides it wants to tax this guy, it can maybe go through his history of M-Pesa transactions to see how much money he's making. In that sense, yeah, it's bringing them closer. I wouldn't necessarily say it's making them more formal, because then it's going to depend on what we're going to think is formal in the bottom. But it's bringing them closer. Yeah, it's maybe bridging the gap that has been the whole point of this interaction. And I think when you ask me about maybe putting it in a dichotomy of formal and informal, it goes a bit in that way too, but there's also a bit of a language trap here, because I don't really know how to put these questions without separating them between formal and informal. And that's one of the problems, right? The fact that there is no word and there is no explanation to all these activities, that they're not formally inserted in the state apparatus, but they do have regulations in place. They do have a clear organization. They do have a functioning system that people understand and that people trust in. Then if formality means regulation, then yes, they have a big part, they have a big aspect of formality in them. Maybe the argument here, and that's an argument that is and it's closer to what Gregory was mentioning earlier, maybe the whole problem is that the whole Westphalian nation state doesn't make sense anymore. The whole system of huge bureaucracy, Weberian bureaucracy, is not helping anymore. The whole argument for Weber for modern bureaucracy is that this is what was going to make all citizens have access to the same things. This is clearly not working. So maybe it's even further the point here, and you look at the Occupy movements, or you look at protests of people who do not feel represented by their politicians, which is something our resilience here can talk about, because we've been living that for 4 years now. Maybe the point that brings to what we're talking here, why is there a bridge is there a gap to be bridged in the first place between formal and informal, or are they already too muddled to be even thought of as separate parts? Probably. But as long as some services are still formal in the sense of being state-controlled through or by, not necessarily by the state, but through the state at least, it creates problems that we haven't really figured out how to resolve them, how to actually embrace what is new about what is born outside the state, if we don't want to use the word informal here, but what's born outside any kind of regulatory framework or traditional framework of the state, or without an official paper trail, for example. Yeah, maybe the problem is even linguistic in the end. We don't even have a word for what's happening, I suppose. And you're also talking a bit about collective action, right? And so when we talk about these systems, that they work very well without the state, that's a bit about collective action as well, which, yeah, I think that's a big thing here about how collective action in certain cases have been more able to provide services that in theory are public better than the actual public service. So how should they learn from each other or interact or be merged in a sense? I don't know, but yeah, I think maybe there's also a linguistic gap there that we need to figure out. If I may, when Renato was talking, it reminded me of an article I read recently about this this algorithm that was created to give sentences to people in the United States. So people who were in justice, you would put the information about the crime and about their characteristics in it, and it would give you a sentence. So the idea was to make it less prone to the tendency of a jury or a judge. But then what they used as a basis for it was this huge history of decisions made by juries and judges. And basically the algorithm was doing what it had been seen before. The algorithm was giving higher prison sentences to Black people. So it made a lot of sense in the beginning, right? You take out any prejudice that the judge or the jury may have or anything else. But how do you do that without the knowledge that we've built for decades without any algorithm in place? So it didn't work. It's a good thing that they were only testing, so no one was actually sent to jail because of the algorithm. But it talks a bit to what we are discussing here, that we don't even know how to deal with it. We know that it's a possibility. You know, we have an idea of how many possibilities technology is bringing, but we don't really even know for sure how to deal with them and how to make them work. Sometimes we think it's going to work and it doesn't. And sometimes out of the blue comes something that works really well, and you're going to say, wow, who would say that worked? So there's a bit of chaos there maybe, but I think it's a good sort of chaos. It's the chaos that basically leaves the doors open for any possibility in the end.
It's very interesting. Let me just come back with a contrast. Your last point is very good, because indeed, like all technologies, algorithmic systems can be good and bad. And they are also, although they have a self-generating aspect, they're also in the end created by human beings, and machines and robots can be controlled by human beings. In California today, as we sit here, they have implemented an AI system that makes decisions based on data about bail. You know, when you're arrested in America, when you're arrested for a crime, you're charged, and then depending on the severity of the crime and so forth, a certain amount, you post a bond, you give a guarantee you're not going to run away, a financial and you lose that deposit if you don't show up in court. So what they found was that decisions about bail bond made by judges were highly colored by human prejudices, and often racially and economically driven. But they were able to create an algorithm that's working very well to make these decisions based on various probabilities. And again, the power of the algorithm, the power of artificial intelligence, is that you can feed in huge amounts of data. So your decision is based, or the decision that's given is more fair. So it's the double-edged sword of technology. Can be good, can be bad. Let's take another round of questions. Francisco?
Me?
Oh, okay, you go first, Michael.
Okay, thank you very much. I think excellent lectures again, and it just puts more fuel into the tank. If we're starting with a motor car as if it was with the
you speak up.
We're starting
Better.
From like an excellent motor car, but with the gearbox inverted. So you accelerate and you very high thing, but we don't get anywhere. We've got to get somewhere. And I think come back to the basics. If we want to move from win-lose, which has been the basis of economics for centuries, and go back to win-win, which works very often, if we look at our own human biological biosystemic system for optimizing, taking a sensorial pulse, identifying and optimizing if it's a threat or if it's pleasure, if it's what we need, we can start learning. And I have a practical experience of having been asked a very difficult question of what products, what technologies can be used to enable everybody to have good jobs, to have full dignity in their lives, ethics, and the climate as well. And you come back to, well, if you really want to look at it, we have to look at, well, what is harmonic progression and harmonic regression, looking from the vector of biosystemics, because that is how all biological matter is created. You have, that's where originally in some cultures, people will be able to correct me much better, because I believe it came from Asia and the Indian subcontinent as well, is getting back to vibrational physics, then the mathematics, and then saying, well, you know, if I want a glass of water, I looked at here, I got a water here, I found it, I put out my hand, and I bring it to my lips and I drink just about enough as I want. But if we look at how our DNA is programmed and our history, we get exactly to what is harnessed and what is unharnessed, and therefore what is optimal and what is not optimal. Why large creatures, there was not enough food for them, so they became cannibalistic, thousands of years ago. We've developed, and we have to get from win-lose to win-win. And if we understand that win-win is the golden mean of life in the mathematical context, and you put that in all the world's universities of research, you're going to come out with the fact it's not massive excess profits or excess losses or excess emission. It is the golden mean which everything harmonizes, the harmonization of duality of forces. So
Thank you, Michael. That's very good.
I want to get that clearly into the thought process, because it will just, excuse me, just say one thing. You can't expect to achieve systemically sustainable development if we don't understand how we work to make us systemically sustainable. Thank you very much for excellent set of lectures, and great to meet you people. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for your comment, Michael. Francisco is next. He's way up. Put your hand up so she knows where to bring the mic.
Hello, my name is Francisco from RANEPA. I'm actually from Mexico. And
Speak up.
My question is to Gregory. In the sense that I agree absolutely with everything you said about Mexico. And I think that the biggest trouble by policymaking processes are essentially a very wide distribution of power among states. And of course, short electoral periods within them. I would like to know if you have a suggestion on how this information could essentially reorganize this Mexican political electoral system.
One more question? Put up.
Thank you. A simple one. What will the future dictator look like?
Why do we have to look to the future? We have lots of current examples.
I'm just trying to reorganize my life, so your answers will be vital for me.
We're all trying to reorganize our life, Corral, and we're not doing well.
Okay. Is his job in jeopardy?
Either any questions?
You have a very good question, and a very difficult question for us to ask, because if we could for a while try to forget we are humans and we are the top of evolution, and we are looking at an environment like a perfect ruler, and we would have to decide what is doing well and what is not doing well. The type of decisions that we expect that machines could do, like the paper I was showing you in 2040, do we need humans at all to carry on our our roles as people that inhabits the planet? This may sound a little cliche, but this is the kind of questions that we are afraid to ask, because if we try to enhance the reason of the machines without trying to enhance the way we are as human beings with wars and things like that, it's perfectly reasonable for a machine to wipe the human race in some way. And this will be a win-win way of doing things. So there are people that believe that the moment of the singularity is coming. People believe that it can come in 10 years and 20 years, but the machines are approaching the type of heuristics that we do as human beings, the type of decisions, and we can mimic affections and the way we think that distinguish as humans to the other types of life forms. And if we try to design a perfect machine, do we have still a role as inhabitants in this world with perfect machines? I leave to you to think about. I've been thinking about this, but in a different time scale, if we should see what we should trust or bet for the next years, I would try to look at the cryptocurrencies and the type of derivatives that is being built in this new digital economy, the smart contracts and technologies that perhaps in a few years will disrupt the current banking systems and the central authorities we have in some countries. And this is a good side, a good thing to think. There are many models in which people are exchanging goods and doing investments without banks, without trust in a central authority. And this is a way of a beautiful way we can see for the new economy. This is my take on your question.
Okay. Francisco, muchas gracias. The question here is that, this is an experiment that's just started. So it's a good question. How's it going to reorganize Mexico? I think the law's already done quite a bit in Mexico. You probably know this, but the same problems exist. You know that as well, right? I mean, the dirty tricks and the old games and the corruption and so forth and so on. So it's certainly not a panacea by any means. The greatest hope that we can have is not that it purges corruption, but it helps make better decisions and, inspires citizens to be a little more conscientious about government decisions and policy, and improves the media and so forth. So I think the changes will be incremental. They'll be small at first, but it's an experiment. This has never been done before. And I think that more study needs to happen. And as a Mexican, maybe even you might consider doing study on this, because they approved 3 laws, a national constitutional, essentially freedom of information law that includes open data and personal data, meaning protection of personal data, not gathering personal data. A archive law, which is national as well, which will increase open data and digitizing archives and so forth, and a personal protection law, which I already mentioned. So, Deepan, you asked me a question before and I skipped over it. Sorry about that. So you asked and said, you basically were wondering what sort of global leadership could we see on this issue of information. And, I think that the UNESCO has tried to a certain extent. It's certainly been the provocateur of this giant diffusion of freedom of information laws. I mean, along with the World Bank and the usual suspects, right? They have encouraged diffusion of these legal instruments and encouraged open data portals and so forth. The OGP, which is the Open Government Partnership, which of India, I don't believe India is part. Russia is now part. In any case, this was started by Obama, co-chaired by Dilma Rousseff back in the good days, 2011 it started. And that is exactly what Open Government Partnership was for, was essentially to advance the cause of transparency, open government, participation, accountability, and so forth. But we really do lack, leadership in this area, I think, nonetheless. Okay. Right. So you're talking about an independent institution at a global level. Well, but I'm looking at more in enforcement terms on a national level. And so I don't think that any international institution has real enforcement anywhere in the world right now. And so in that sense, I think it's a difficult.
Yeah, and it's hard to imagine, if I were to ask you of a model of an independent international body, it drives me nuts when I work with people in UN agencies who say, remember, we work for the governments, we can't do anything unless the government approves. So it's very hard to create some supra body that would be truly independent. It's a real challenge. Well, thank you all. Thank you very much for being here at the conference. It's not over yet. Don't go anywhere. But this panel is drawing to an end. And we thank very much our three panelists, and I think the audience response shows what a good job they've done. Celso, would you like to say a few words? That's what the program says.
I was wondering what could I say under the label of concluding remarks. And first, I'd like to thank our assistants, Veronica, Carlos Eduardo, and the people from the technological side who helped us to have this conference. And as the host of this year's conference, after 2 full days of discussion, plus 2 days of this seminar, the student seminar, I'm happy to see that we had the opportunity to discuss important subjects, issues regarding public policy in a let's say, critical way, thus bringing some different perspectives, just an exercise in line with our logo, the logo we choose for the conference, this representation of the world turned upside down. And I'm proud of especially of two innovations we had this year. And the conference, we had the live streaming on the internet. So we have now an archive, more data available on the internet, on the archive of our alliance, which is available and in good quality to use with our students, colleagues, and to have recorded what we've discussed here at the conference. And we had another remarkable novelty this year, which was our first course, Students Workshop. I'm very proud of raising this idea in the last year's conference and how it was embraced by all of us. And I think it was really an excellent seminar, and I hope it will happen again. And if this alliance has any future, grand part of it depends on our students and how in the coming years these student workshops will work. Well, I'm also very happy you made your way to Rio. It's very far from your countries. I had this feeling when I went to China, India, or Moscow, flying 15 plus hours, but it's not the same distance from your countries. I think I should also ask to forgive us to understand the flaws we had in the logistics or organization of the conference. I believe it's not an easy task to take care of so many details at the same time. But I hope we could compensate that with our hospitality. And since I know it's the first time of several of you in Rio and Brazil, for several of you have enjoyed your time here and have a nice experience. And I think that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Celso. In public policy, one of the things we teach is to prioritize. So the first thing and the most important thing I want to say is a huge thanks to our wonderful hosts, to Celso, to Veronica, to Carlos Eduardo, and the rest of the staff for both for their hospitality, which is unparalleled, and also for their efficiency, for which twice now Celso has apologized. Said, I'm sorry if we've fallen short in any regard. And the answer is no, you haven't. It's really been a wonderfully comfortable and organized conference, and we all thank you deeply. And I think we've also felt very welcome and happy to be here in Brazil in various ways and to be in Rio, which is a wonderful city. In IDPPA, I hope we keep getting better and better. I think this conference, as Celso noted, with the addition of students, with the live streaming, and not yet over for some of you, because I remind the senior members, the members from the institutions, the faculty, that we have a meeting at 9:30 tomorrow, our business meeting, at which we look forward and start planning our new activities, which I think all share the idea that they will accelerate and increase and take us into some new things we haven't done before, like the student workshop. I remind the students again that I count on you to be a network and to create your own network. We don't want to create one for you. We'll certainly help you and support you in any way with moral or material support, a lot of the first and maybe very little of the second. But nevertheless, you all know each other now, and this forms the basis for a global network of students. Finally, I want to say that I continue to be amazed and moved by the brilliance and articulateness of all my colleagues here. As some of you, but not all of you know, and I mentioned in the opening, the book of essays that came out of our deliberations in Istanbul, and that gave me a clue to how much real intellectual and policy firepower there is in IDPPA. And I think, as in all policy matters, the challenge is how to use that brilliance effectively, how to move forward in our individual work, in our collective work, and most importantly, and how to make the world a better place for everyone equally. Thank you very much. Photo time. Now, I lived in China for 7 years, and what they taught me there was, if there's no photo, it didn't happen. So come up, everybody from IDPPA, please. Thank you. Yeah, I think this is a nice place with the. Okay.